Thank you.
I thank the member for honours. Question is the amendment be agreed to, and I call the member for Chifley.
Thanks, Deputy Speaker. It has been a long march towards this legislation. A number of years now have passed. We actually, in government, had started looking at this issue. I do remember having concerns then, as I do now, and I've been upfront all along about the impact of this type of legislation. I'm not alone. The member for Wentworth, now Minister for Communications, has expressed his concerns in times past, and he has not been the only one on his side of the fence, and certainly not on our side of the fence, for a number of reasons. I have, however, attempted in this process to have an open mind. I've said all along that I was to be, or remain to be, convinced about the need to undertake the breadth and scope of what is being proposed in this legislation and in legislation past. And I waited for the report, and I actually did go through the report, and I in particular wanted to commend my colleagues, the members that were on that committee, and in particular the Shadow Attorney-General and Shadow Communications Minister for the work that they've done in proposing a number of changes to what had been put forward by the government last year. But having said that, I think it's only fair, it's only right, it's only proper, particularly given that we're told that parliamentary oversight will be a feature of this system in years to come. Well, I'd like to exercise my ability as a parliamentarian to express some concerns and ensure that in due course that they're addressed along with other concerns that are expressed by colleagues in this chamber on either side of the House. Some expressed publicly, others expressed privately. In saying that and recognising that there are deep feelings and concerns, I think it's important, again, if I come back to this point about having an open mind, there will be people who will not be convinced whatsoever about the need to do what is being proposed by this legislation. There will also be people on the other side of the argument who refuse to be convinced that those concerns are valid. However, we have a responsibility to find the midway point, and I think it is important to recognise, along with the concerns, that there are some things that will be done by this legislation that are important. My concerns relate to the scope and the effectiveness of what's being proposed. They relate to the cost and the impact on telecommunications companies, and they also relate to the adequacy of parliamentary oversight. But having said all that, and having read the report and having seen the comments of law enforcement, I do recognise most certainly that law enforcement will benefit from having access to metadata. There is no denying that. For people to not accept that is to ignore reality. And I certainly appreciate the ability in trying to determine the undertaking of criminal behaviour, who is responsible for it, and the ability of metadata to provide some assistance in that. I certainly recognise that, and I think it should be appreciated. We also need to recognise too that for law enforcement agencies trying to undertake their important work, that times have changed. We do not have the plain, simple telephone networks of old. We don't chase down facsimiles. We have a multitude of platforms, and we have an explosion in the growth of data that will continue to grow at phenomenal rates down the track. And I do note in there the concerns of law enforcement agencies about their degraded capacity to keep tabs on that. This is important. We can't deny it. So certainly when it comes to law enforcement, appreciate the benefit. But this government, when it introduced this legislation, and in the lead-up to the introduction of the legislation last year, its foundation stone for this legislation was national security. And I would humbly suggest that that is contestable, that the notion that this will have major benefit from a national security perspective, I think is a contestable claim and does need to be tested. Because if the argument is that metadata will help identify and thwart terrorism suspects, you also need to recognise that the terrorism threat has evolved. We appreciate that now we do not have actors that are in sophisticated, complicated, collective activity that what we have now, and what is a serious threat to us, is isolated, unstable individuals who determine all of a sudden to do something, and they will not have necessarily communicated with others, though I do accept that there is the possibility that they would have been in contact with others, but largely they may be sporadic. They may be under the age of 18, they may have been influenced improperly by what they've seen on social media or other outlets, and they've decided to act on their own. And there is a degree of caution about whether or not this would have prevented the type of attacks that we've seen in the last 12 months. And this is not something that I just pluck out of the air. It's actually contained in the report, 2.57 of the report on page 25. And I note the following. The committee noted evidence that data retention would likely not have enabled agencies to prevent these incidents. New South Wales Police gave considered evidence on this point, emphasising that attempting to determine whether such information could have assisted in hindsight necessarily involves a hypothetical counterfactual exercise. Quote, as a hypothetical, with the nature of Sydney itself and where law enforcement would benefit from metadata in relation to, say, the Sydney incident, it most likely would not have prevented the Sydney incident. That's an important quote to bear in mind. I also read the remainder of the quote, which says, at the time, metadata could have been essential in trying to identify any other persons who may be engaged in a group or involved in that type of offence. And that was Assistant Commissioner Lanyon and in the committee Hansard in the committee hearing that took place on 30 January this year. So, as I say, it is contestable whether or not it would necessarily have a benefit from a national security viewpoint, and we should be mindful of it, because we are about, through this legislation, to undertake a massive effort to capture a massive amount of data that will be held for 2 years. For 2 years. Who you spoke to, when you spoke to them, how long you spoke to them for, how often you speak to them. This type of information does not necessarily rely on the content alone. It can establish a profile based on these type of behaviours. This is a serious issue, and it will create a digital fingerprint of every single person in the nation. It's worth noting too that the number of people that are on active surveillance or who are being watched is not the entire populace. It is a small number of people. I would have argued, for example, I'd be interested to see why we aren't reforming the preservation notice mechanism and trying to improve that mechanism as a way to basically capture metadata of people that are under active surveillance and ensure that that's done over that period of time, as opposed to the breadth and depth of what is being proposed here. And what we are going to let through is fairly significant, and I think it's important that that be recognised. It is also important to recognise too that in undertaking that, we should test whether or not it would be effective. I've made reference to some of the quotes earlier. I also make reference to testimony given by the Law Council of Australia. And what they said was, and I quote, when they looked at other jurisdictions and when they tested out whether or not mandatory data retention, what its effectiveness was, you look at page 38 of the report, and it quotes directly, there is little evidence from comparable jurisdictions that had previously had mandatory data retention schemes to suggest such schemes actually assist in reducing the crime rate. For example, in Germany, research indicates that a mandatory data retention scheme led to an increase in the number of convictions by only 0.006%. Again, it is important that we remember that in this exercise, as much as I have already indicated earlier that law enforcement will benefit from this, we also need to recognise that when it's been tested, some of these figures have come up. The other area where I am concerned on this relates to cost. And I have to say I am deeply concerned with the number of figures that have been bandied around about how much this will cost telecommunications companies to set up the systems to ensure that this massive collection and retention of data occurs. We had IINet indicate early on $400 million. I understand the Prime Minister may have used a figure of $300 million. An industry working group established a bandwidth of between roughly $180 million and $300 million. But we've not had any firm commitment from the government about what it will do in the establishment and ongoing maintenance of such systems. Now, bigger players like Telstra and Optus will understandably be able to absorb a lot of the costs. They've got the wherewithal to do it. I am concerned, and I'm not the only one, because the industry is concerned as well, about what impact this would have on smaller players. That's why a number of them wrote to the minister at the table and to his colleague, the Attorney-General, saying that this cost issue had to be resolved. And I think it is unfair that this is left unresolved and that there is not a firm commitment given. The suggestion is that this will be passed off to the budget. This is not right. We had, for example, today, the government announced a measure where they would reverse something in relation to bank accounts and lost superannuation accounts. And they announced on the spot, without any notice, $300 million is the cost of this system today, reversing a previous government law. $300 million today, announced on the spot. Why are our telecommunications companies not given this assurance? Instead, they are forced to wait on the prospect that it will be fixed up in the budget. And this is wrong. This should be fixed up now, because one of the things that we may have a lot of disagreements across this table, but one of the things we reckon works well is competition within the telecommunications sector. The multitude of players offering a multitude of services and being able to put pressure on big players is important. But if we keep adding to the cost of those smaller players, we make their viability uncertain. And I would implore the minister, and I'm sure that he has done this because he knows, as well as others, the cost pressures on those smaller players, because it's not just this. I mean, Australia's internet and telecommunications costs are relatively high on the world standard, and we are going to add with this, if we do not fully fund the CapEx requirements, they will have to pass through these costs or die. They will have to pass through the costs. I'll withdraw the word, but certainly it will put massive pressure on their ability to continue their operations. And it's not the only cost in the pipeline. I mean, when you look at TSSR and the Telecommunications Sector Security Review and the cost implications that might come out of that, there are added costs as well. And we have done nothing to provide some assurance to those companies. And what is being done is basically this legislation, the government will want to rush this legislation through, give no assurance, and then when there's no ability to actually ensure that those people are looked after, they'll then no doubt lowball the amount and put pressure on those small companies, even though they've got the ability today to fix it up. The other issue that I wanted to impact or impress upon people is on parliamentary oversight. For this to work, understanding that this is more likely than not to go through both houses of parliament, when it is set up, it is my fervent wish that when parliamentary oversight is exercised, and this takes nothing away from the calibre and the commitment and the determination of my colleagues in sitting on those committees in the future, I would hope that we would continue to test the assumptions that are put forward, because security agencies will, by their very nature, be very cautious and want to ensure the full breadth of measures available to them can be exercised. But you can't necessarily write a blank cheque on these things, and I am genuinely worried that all it takes for a security agency to say is we need these powers if we don't, terrible things happen. We're going to have to test it. Our job as parliamentarians is to balance out the need for security and the need for the exercise of free liberty, or freer liberties. So it's certainly something that needs to be dealt with. People are concerned about this. People outside this chamber recognise that the general groundswell of opinion is for people, for governments and for companies to lay off privacy. I mean, if you get Tim Cook here in CNET, quoted early in March, who says in an article, Tim Cook to governments, lay off our privacy. The Apple CEO saying that governments would need to be very mindful of people's privacy down the track. If someone like in Apple gets it, they are picking it up because their consumers are telling it to them. They are responding, and this is not an issue that's going to go away. The next generation of voters, the next generation of Australians will value more and more their privacy, and that's why there is such concern on this. So again, I recognise that we have to balance out the issues that confront law enforcement, recognise the value of being able to have access to data that can help them in their work, but I also recognise, and I think I also respect, the value placed by the citizens of this country on their privacy, I recognise and value the work being done by telecommunications companies that will be impacted by this, and I certainly hope that these type of concerns are tested in the years to come. And bear in mind, this system will be set up in 2 years and then tested in 2 years after that. This is a long period of time for this system to be in
Thank the member for
operation.
Chifley. The question is the amendment